What I want to do is first of all say something about the Japanese industry post-war, then about Ooshima's own career, before getting on to talking about two things really. One, his as it were, theoretical positions, and he's written a great deal about the cinema, as well as making many films. And then to talk something about, to give some kind of way of approaching it, shall we say, his films, which, as those of you who've seen many of them will know, are, among other things, very diverse. He started making films at the very end of the 50s. His first film was in 1959. At that time, Japanese cinema was dominated, was still a studio system cinema essentially similar to the American cinema, and moreover, it had not yet been severely hit by the development of television. It was actually far more like the American cinema 10 years earlier in the 1940s than the American cinema of the late 50s. It was dominated by a big 5 or 6. Shintoho collapsed in 1961. There's about 6 major studios: Shochiku, Nikatsu, Daiei, Toei, Toho, and Shintoho. It was the thing which characterizes it as distinct from the American cinema of the 30s and 40s, the period of studio dominance, is that the relation between studios and cinemas, between the production and exhibition, is a one-to-one one between cinema and studio. That is, the films from one of the studios were block and blind booked as a whole into each cinema separately. This has very important consequences for the type of cinema that's produced. The first and most obvious is that it simply means every studio has to produce sufficient product to fill its cinemas every year. And that means very strict and very large, relatively, production schedules. You can actually buy in, of course, foreign films, and the big studios functioned as distributors for foreign films as well. But even so, it meant pressure for production of a larger product than was typical of each studio in the American cinema at the same in the 30s and 40s. Secondly, it means that particular cinemas are linked to, as it were, publicly recognizable as producing separate types of films to a much greater degree than is the case in America. The American system, which, as I suspect many of you know, although the cinemas were, the first-run cinemas were very largely owned by the majors before 1949, they had a policy of effectively showing each other's films, which is a kind of, on the one hand, provides a kind of co-guarantee that if your films of that year are not doing too well, you gain from everybody else's successes. But it also means that when people go to the cinema, they won't know when they go to cinema A whether they're going to see an MGM film or a Warner Brothers film in particular. With the result that effectively there's a kind of pressure to uniformize, and all the studios, although they specialize to a certain degree, usually manage to make sure that they were always capable also of producing in the whole range of genres which are contemporarily available. Japanese cinema, because you have this specialized relationship between individual cinemas and individual studios, developed much more strikingly, I think, a specific studio-based character, a studio character for films. The so-called Shochiku flavor is quite famous, or the Ofuna flavor as it was called after the Ofuna studios of Shochiku. In 1959, the Japanese cinema produced 493 full-length feature films, and their seat prices were something like 1,088 million. The number of seats sold is 1,088 million. 10 years later, the Japanese cinema had in fact been hit by television. The really big expansion of television in Japan takes place in the 60s. 10 years later, only 286 million seats were sold, which is an absolutely catastrophic drop. On the other hand, 492 films, full-length feature films, were made in Japan in 1969. And you can see in that set of statistics how the pressure of studio demand means that films are still being made, even though revenue coming in is falling, and it was falling, even though in fact seat prices rose quite markedly between 1959 and 1969. Something like revenue fell something like a half in that period. The result was, in fact, that the average production costs of films fell by something like a half. The ways that cut was in fact distributed was into the division of production into a quality area, where a very small number of films were made which still had the budgets of the films before, and a very large number of cheap films with low production costs. At the same time, you had the growth of specifically exploitation genres directed at specific markets, whereas, again, in the classic period in America and in Japan up to the end of the 50s, most films were produced for an audience conceived of as all Japanese. By the end of the 60s, more and more of the Japanese cinema was moving off into specialized genres which were conceived of as having quite specific audiences, went into specific cinemas and so on. One of the most important of these was the so-called pink films or eroductions, which in the 1969 figure of 492 films accounted for 237 of the feature films. But there were also Yakuza films, monster films, and women's pictures became actually more and more specialized, particularly at the lower budget end of the market. So you have the development of an exploitation cinema of the kind, of course, that you also get in the 60s and 70s in America too. On the other hand, it's mostly being produced within, at least initially, within the major studios themselves and not by independent producers outside. The immediate result of this is the rise of young directors inside the major studios. Whereas the Japanese cinema up to this time had in effect an apprenticeship system of director training, where people entered the cinema, as it were, on graduation, were apprenticed to one or occasionally several, but existing director, and then, as it were, progressed to directing at a relatively late stage in their career, and were trained, as it were, learnt the works under a specific director, and so you have a kind of ladder of promotion structure. Because of this change in the structure of the product, there was opened up an area of activity for younger directors. And this was directly sponsored by the heads of the studios. And a number of young people, young assistant directors, were more or less pulled out of a hat, or in fact selected on fairly uncertain grounds by studio heads to direct their own films, so as to produce these kind of very cheap exploitation films, but also with the hope that there would be a new audience pulled into the cinema, an audience of young people. And in Shochiku, Oshima, Shinoda, and Yoshida all came up in this way. In Nikatsu, Imamura, and directors we know less in this country, in the other majors. And so you have a whole group of directors emerging in the late 50s, early 60s, making semi-exploitation films on very small budgets in a fairly experimental way, but as I said, within the major studios in the late 50s, early 60s. This was in fact dubbed quite deliberately as a publicity maneuver by the studios, the Nouvelle Vague of the Japanese cinema. At the same time, in the 60s, you get the growth of the possibilities of independent production. In, again, a similar way to the American cinema, usually, initially at least, in a distribution tie-up with the majors, that is, the films produced independently were distributed through one of the major studios, but increasingly, a specifically art movie, an originally foreign movie, distributor became involved in distributing independent production, which is the Arts Theatre Guild, ATG, which put up the funding for quite a few of Oshima's films. The 1970s, in fact, saw a catastrophic continuing of the decline of the Japanese cinema. Many directors, in fact, moved out to work, if they worked at all, for television, and the cinema itself simply contracted very, very much, and effectively lost very much kind of systematic, this kind of systematic organisation which had produced the so-called Nouvelle Vague. And very, very recently, some directors, and Oshima, of course, is perhaps the most important, have been making films with foreign money and essentially for foreign audiences. And of course, the last two Oshima films are both essentially French films. I mean, they have a certain amount of, they are produced by Oshima Productions, his own production company, but essentially the money which went into them was French. And they are, in fact, Empire of the Senses has not even been shown in Japan, I think. They are certainly designed for a foreign market. Right, to turn to talking about Oshima himself. He was born in 1932 in Kyoto. His family came from Tsushima and were of samurai origin. He's therefore of that generation which went through most of their school before the end of the Second World War. In that sense, he's, I suppose, very similar to quite a lot of the new German cinema directors, who again have the same thing, going through most of their early youth and schooling during a regime which was then subsequently defeated by the Western powers at the end of the the Allied powers at the end of the Second World War. In Japan, that defeat also involved American occupation and the attempt, at least initially, to democratize Japan, an attempt which involved also the legalization of the Japanese Communist Party and the encouragement of trade unions, and indeed produced a mass movement for democratization. And in fact, Oshima himself, in his last years in high school after the war, was an important student activist within this movement. As far as I know, he was never actually a member of the Japanese Communist Party. He was what's called a non-sect radical in Japan. He was an activist, but without belonging to any one of the particular student sects or the major political parties. In 1950, he became a member of the law faculty at the University of Kyoto, and the vice president of the local Zengakuren, the student self-governing organization. The Kyoto branch of this was dissolved in 1951 as a result of an incident involving a visit of the emperor to the university. But when it was then revived in 1953, Oshima became the regional president, and was again involved in a major student confrontation which led, in fact, to the injury of 70 students and the expulsion of 6, not in fact including Oshima himself, but to its effective failure in terms of achieving its particular aims. And when he went down in 1954, Oshima was extremely disillusioned with the political activity he'd been involved in. He tried to get a number of jobs, but he was in effect blacklisted as having been a major student activist. The jobs were mostly in journalism. And at least so he says, he only actually went to take the exam for assistant directors at Shochiku Studios because a friend wanted to take the exams and didn't want to go alone, and so Oshima went along too. He, in fact, passed out first in the exam, again, according to his own claim, simply because he cheated, and he was given by one of the examiners the answer to the most difficult question, and therefore actually was the only person who answered and came in top. That's, as it were, his own account anyway of what happened. Incidentally, the idea of exams for assistant directors shows something about actually what the character of the industry was like. At this time, the assistant director who passed went into an apprenticeship place within the industry, as it were, and into a kind of office job. It's very much like getting a job in any other white-collar type of job in Japan at this time, and indeed still. He worked, in fact, as an assistant director for a variety of directors. He never actually established himself firmly as anybody's apprentice. For Kobayashi, for Oba, for Nomura, and in a sense he was a bad assistant director by the standards of the Japanese cinema. He spent most of his time, in fact, writing scripts and film criticism. In 1959, Kido Shuro, the head of Shochiku, simply picked one of his scripts as being apt to make a movie which would appeal to contemporary Japanese youth. And this film was made as A Town of Love and Hope. The title was chosen against Oshima's will, incidentally. The film was not what Shochiku had intended as a youth film. In particular, the hope which was added to the title by the producers was, as it were, signally absent in the story. What they wanted was a hopeful film about youth, and what they got was actually a fairly desperate film about youth. And they gave it a fairly minor release, and it made very little money. On the other hand, it was a considerable critical success. And although Oshima at the time thought, and it did look as if this was just a flash in the pan, in fact they came back to him as a result of this critical success, and in fact he made 3 films for Shochiku in 1960. And it's in 1960 that the notion of the Nouvelle Vague really gets off the ground, and these films were, as it were, made partly within the actual publicity which was derived from this idea of the Nouvelle Vague, which, as one can imagine, Oshima himself very violently rejected, or rejects, as being a kind of totally artificial label, which was kind of added to the films to increase their saleability. The first 2 films he made in 1960 more or less follow on from A Town of Love and Hope. They are essentially youth films within this cheap budget, semi-exploitation area. But the third film he made, Night and Fog in Japan, which was released in the autumn of 1960 and made in the summer of 1960, marks actually a very radical break for Oshima himself, and actually in some senses for the Japanese cinema. As 1960 was a very important year politically in post-war Japanese history. It was the year of the first renewal of the Japan-America Security Treaty. This renewal was violently opposed by the Japanese left, and in particular by the student movement, and this opposition to the resignature culminated in very large demonstrations around the Diet, the Japanese Parliament, in, I think, the early summer of 1960. In these demonstrations, in fact, resulted in the death of one girl student. A Night and Fog in Japan was made in response to this by Oshima and by, in fact, the team that he'd built up over his 4 movies previously. Why it was accepted by Shochiku in the first place, I don't know. Partly maybe that they thought they could cash in precisely on the student movement, because it is a film which is really very remarkable for its date. Anybody who's seen it, it doesn't look like a film made in 1960 at all. It does look like a film, if it was made in Europe, it would indeed exactly look like a film made after 1968. And you've got, in some sense, the same kind of way in which a massive political movement has produced a considerable transformation of cinematic form, taking it well beyond the kind of experiments which which are found in Oshama's first three films. The film was released in the autumn of 1960 and then withdrawn after 3 days. Shochiku claimed it got very, very bad audiences. Oshima claims that it was a political maneuver, and there is good evidence that he is right, that the secretary of the Japanese Socialist Party was assassinated on the 3rd day of the release, producing a general atmosphere of enormous crisis in Japan politically, and Shochiku withdrew the film immediately afterwards, and it's fairly clear that that was done for reasons, as it were, of political tact, if nothing else. In December of 1960, Oshima married his chief star, Koyama Akiko, and in an incident which is both famous and ironic for those of you who've seen the ceremony, at the wedding, he invited all the Shochiku top brass to the wedding and then denounced them for the banning of the film at the wedding. As a result, though in fact it took rather longer than, you might think in 1961, he in fact moved out of Shochiku and worked independently. First for a number of small companies, making The Catch in 1961, and then Shiro Tokisada from Amakusa in 1962, and then in effect didn't work in films again for 3 years. He worked for television between 1963 and 1965, making primarily documentaries. In 1965, he founded his own production company, the Sozosha, or Creation Society, and then began the series of films by which he is now best known in the West. Yunbogi's Diary was made the same year. Then that was followed by 1966 by Midday Demon, 1968 Death by Hanging and Three Resurrected Drunkards, 1969 Diary of a Shinjuku Thief and Boy, 1970 The Man Who Left His Will on Film, 1971 The Ceremony, 1973 Summer Sister. In the first years, most of these were distributed, in fact, by Shochiku, so as it were, the breach with them was not by any means absolute. The later group of films were, in fact, distributed by Arts Theatre Guild and were, therefore, in that sense, totally independent. In 1973, Oshima dissolved the Sozosha, giving as his reason the fact that the further collapse of the Japanese industry meant in practice that this kind of attempt to set up a kind of independent cinema was unnecessary, because effectively the studios were so desperate that you could make anything you liked within the studio system. On the other hand, he himself didn't succeed in making any films in the next 3 years, so the prediction was presumably wrong. In 1976, he made a deal with Anatole Doma for the Franco-Japanese production of Empire of the Senses, Aino Corrida, and 2 years later, his latest film, as far as I know, Aino Bore, called Empire of Passion in its English release print. But as I say, these are essentially no longer really Japanese productions. Before turning to talking about Oshima's views, I think it's important to say something about Japanese post-war history in terms of its relation to the films. Most of the films are in fact set in the period since 1945, and almost all of them deal with the history of Japan since 1945 in some way or another. This is most obvious in a film like The Ceremony, which in some sense is the telling through one family, the Sakuradas, of that history. I obviously don't want to try and summarize Japanese post-war history, but I suppose the first thing to emphasize is that there is a very extraordinary kind of decennial or scansion of that history. In the immediate period, 1945 to 9, immediate post-war period, you had a period of liberalization, purges, unionization, and democratization under American sponsorship. But this was brought to an end by the Chinese Revolution the Korean War and indeed the onset of the Cold War generally. And in the Far East, the Cold War was in some sense sealed by, as much as anything, by the Japan-America Security Treaty, which was signed in 1950, and which is, as it were, the key to American Pacific strategy from then on in many ways. Japan itself was not directly involved in the Korean War, but it provided a very major service position for the American Army, both in terms of being a kind of rear for troop relaxation and so on, but also, even more importantly, in providing war materials. And the Japanese economic miracle is very largely based on the Korean War and the Cold War that followed in terms of the particular economic demand that they produced. But at the same time, you had a crackdown on left-wing organization. For a time, the banning of the Japanese Communist Party and the general freezing of Japanese politics into the mold that it's had more or less ever since. That is the dominance of the Liberal Democratic Party, the big Conservative Party, which has not been out of power in central government since 1950. But the crucial thing, in a certain sense, for Oshima in this is that the Japan-America Security Treaty was renewable in 10-year intervals. And as it is, in some senses, the key to Japan's world position and the key to American strategy in the East, Japanese history has, as it were, worked in those 10-year periods. And so you have, for Japanese left-wing politics in particular, because the left-wing organize to try and prevent the re-signature of the treaty every 10 years, the kind of predictability that you have with, as it were, American parliamentary presidential electoral policy, that is, you know exactly when, as it were, with 10 years in advance, you know, as it were, in a certain sense, what the character of, or what the major aim of a particular struggle will be. And this kind of highly predictable type of struggle goes with a character of it which I think most people in Europe find odd about this form of Japanese politics, which is it's often described as its highly ritualized character. It is extremely predictable what the politics will be in the future, as the years go by, and you have the very powerful organization of a very ritualized form of political demonstration. And that again is often organized according to anniversaries and so on. The death of the student, Kamba Michiko, I mentioned, in 1960, her death day and the memorial of her death has always been an occasion since for meetings and demonstrations and so on. And so you have, as it were, this kind of ritual character organized into the political process. The other major thing to mention in relation to Oshima's films is the vicissitudes of the JCP, from being one of the major forces both created in some sense and behind the democratization of the immediate post-war period. During the Korean War, the party was banned, and it also adopted as a strategy an extreme putschist line, the so-called Molotov cocktail policy, consisting of attempting, at least verbally, to reproduce the Chinese-style military or guerrilla military revolution within Japanese conditions, with very little success, of course. This resulted in a split, in fact, occurring in 1950-51, and then a total reversal of policy in the mid-50s, going over to the so-called policy of pursuing the lovable party policy, that is, a very extreme form of what subsequently became known in the West as revisionism, and for which the Italian party in the West is the model, but in certain senses the JCP is in some respects very much more extreme. So that the JCP has, as it were, changed very radically within the period, of course, the period Ooshima's own major political activity, and many of his films are actually directly concerned with that. In 1963, Ooshima wrote an article called "The Japanese Cinema Post-War Destruction and Creation." In this article, he made the demand for a genuinely subjective cinema, by which he meant a cinema of directorial self-expression and director's control. The notion of the subject derives apparently from French existentialist writings which were translated into Japanese at this time. The notion indeed is of permanent auto-negation. I mean, destruction and creation means that in effect that every film must be a completely new film, and not only must they not be confined to genres, which of course has been very characteristic of the Japanese cinema, but in a certain sense even a director must constantly be reconstructing his own work. He mustn't simply imitate himself. In a sense, this is fairly easily readable in a straightforward art cinema way. A cinema of authorship, emphasis on the director, on originality, on self-expression. And of course it also fits fairly conveniently into the label Nouvelle Vague, which Shochiku imposed on it. And I suppose lastly it also fits into the international market for art cinema films. And Ooshima's films have very often obtained international distribution, particularly since the break with Shochiku. Before they had international distribution, but they had international distribution precisely as exploitation films, and Ooshima's first films were indeed shown in this country, but as essentially sex and violence films. On the other hand, I think it's important to realise that the notion of the subject that Ooshima deploys is actually rather different, and it's different very largely because of the difference of Japanese conditions and different Japanese traditions, different Japanese politics in relation to a notion of the subject. What's implicit in the notion is the articulation of a demand and its limitation. It's that that desire and prohibition are part of the same system. That the prohibition of certain things, which displaces desire onto the set of things which are licit, which produces a position of relative stability, a stability for the individual in relation to the social order. A stability which is in fact contradictory, and indeed one which precisely sets up a contradiction and a set of, in fact, contradictions between civil society and the state, the private and the public, and if you like, love and duty, and indeed a whole series of classical artistic or fictional oppositions. The notion of the citizen, in fact, in Western societies in particular, in which the subject is very highly implicit. I mean, the subject and the citizen are in certain senses partly coterminous, involve some form of reconciliation of the individual's private concerns and private life and his or her place in the public order in relation to the state, to political action, and so on. And as I say, this form has given rise to, or this contradictory unity has given rise to a whole series of fictions which precisely rehearse or organize those contradictions. The obvious one, as I say, is the Racine conflict of love and duty. In the more novelistic mode, it's the way the opposition between the private individual, and in particular the private individual as fiction and fantasy, is placed against and organized in relation to a background which is one of realism. I mean, in the historical novel, it's fairly obviously that private and public and fiction and fact are, as it were, mapped onto one another. In effect, what you've got in the notion of a subject isn't simply a particular philosophical notion, but a whole entity constituted by the intersection of a whole series of different practices, economic, political, legal, and artistic, discursive, as well as it were, theoretical and philosophical. Essentially, therefore, what one is dealing with in talking about the subject is the problem of the coherence of these various levels. And indeed, this coherence is I think, quite arguable. The unity of the individual as a citizen, private life, with a private life, but also a public life, which places him as an equal with other citizens before law and the state, is a relatively recent historical construct. And in particular in Europe, it's a construct of absolutism. A construct of absolutism which is then, as it were, taken over by the revolutionary bourgeois states of the end of the 18th century and the 19th century. Equality of subjects before the king becoming equality of citizens to the state. Japan, on the other hand, doesn't have such a simple form of absolutism, at least. Tokugawa period, the period from 1615 to 1868, is characterized by bureaucratic feudalism. Essentially, there's a paramount feudal house, which, by its greater economic and military strength, is able to dictate certain conditions of existence to the other feudal estates, but within those feudal estates, they, in fact, maintain their own control. It's essentially a kind of negative control over within a system of primus inter pares, with people who are legally and constitutionally equal, and it's only a de facto that the Tokugawa are, in effect, the most powerful feudal house. What this often means is that within the aristocracy itself, and this means within the those strata who are known as the samurai, the shi, or the bushi, you have a local loyalty which is outwardly subordinated to a Tokugawa overlordship. When you turn from that class to the townspeople, the chonin, you have, in effect, a notion of an external conformity to law, which correlates with a kind of public indifference to private indulgence. And in effect, for the peasantry, similarly, you have a kind of total exclusion from politics, where the state is in fact simply defined as tax-paying. And in effect, whole sectors of life in the village and the locality are, as it were, unconnected with the central forms of political order. And the way this system is held together is precisely by a system of confining conflict vertically and horizontally in its locality. The aim is never to allow conflict to spread, but the result is effectively never to have a unified position. You never actually have in Japan, in the Tokugawa period, a conception of the citizen, the individual who has a direct responsibility to the state as such, or to the monarch as such. Each individual is simply placed in his locality and is externally held in that locality by the repressive state apparatus, by actually the instruments of both the local and the national state, but is not, as it were, there as the citizen with obligations, duties, and rights. The result has been to produce very definite effects within Japanese culture, and especially within Japanese urban culture. The culture of, for example, the novels of Ihara Saikaku and of Japanese prince, where in effect a private realm is established which is totally independent of the realm of public duty, and can only, as it were, relate to it in terms of a totally external conflict. There isn't, as it were, precisely that Racinian opposition between private desire and public duty. Particularly in the area of the erotic, it means that you have a quote-unquote oriental relationship to the erotic, a relationship expressed as an art of love rather than as pornography, whereas pornography is very heavily bound up with the actual presence of the prohibition in the act of illicit enjoyment, that the prohibition is very central to the structure of the act of consumption of the erotic object. Within Tokugawa printmaking, the erotic is simply an area of private pleasure, which is untouched by, or perhaps enclosed by, surrounded by, but not actually, as it were, inhabited by, the control of the public sphere. In other words, the private and the public are not, as it were, organised back to back, which it seems to me as they are, at least in the central ideological forms of Western societies, but there is a combination of outward conformity and inward self-gratification, which, as it were, set mutual limits, but those are externally, are, as it were, not mutually defining as such. It's not one and the other together. The result is, as they come into conflict, you tend to get the move towards suicide or various other forms of masochistic solution, which is the characteristic form of, indeed, Japanese fiction in the Tokugawa period, very visibly in the plays of Chikamatsu, where the double suicide is, as it were, the solution to the problem of the impossible love, rather than what I imagine would be the typical Western solution in this time, which is the kind of renunciation. I mean, the kind of melodramatic structure of the renunciation of the illicit love and the return to the position of the dutiful husband, the dutiful wife. In a curious way, in the post-Tokugawa period, the Meiji period, this is then expressed in a kind of extreme statism, if anything. That is, there's a demand on the citizen for a total identification with the state, rather than, again, a way in which the private and the public can be distributed as mutually supporting, which is characteristic of, at least ideologically characteristic, of Western societies. Now, if you look at Oshima's essay and indeed his films in relation to that, the notion of subject, in fact, becomes somewhat different. He writes a kind of history of the post-war cinema in Japan in the essay, The Japanese Cinema, Post-War Destruction and Creation, indeed in all his writings, which he characterizes by two stages and then, as it were, a third, which he hopes to represent himself. And not only is the cinema brought into this model, but so is Japanese politics, and particularly Japanese left-wing politics. The first period is characterized by what he calls the victim consciousness. He's thinking here in particular of films like No Regrets for Our Youth, directed by Kurosawa, and 24 Eyes, directed by Kinoshita, which tell of the sufferings of liberals or the people during the pre-1945 period. And these, particularly in the Kurosawa film, he says there is a kind of optimism, and this is a film made during 45 to 9 period. There is an optimism, a belief that some people did resist, and there is, as it were, a tradition of resistance to call on, but it's still fundamentally a sense of, as it were, mutual victimization. We in the audience were victims of this, just like the people on the screen. In the Kinoshita, he says this goes even further, which is a later film, and a film dating from after the signature of the Japan-America Security Treaty, where indeed there is an important scene where one of the chief characters, who is a school teacher, meets one of her ex-pupils, and the ex-pupil then tells her what terrible things have happened to her because of the military feudal government, and the two weep, and then the teacher says, you know, if in the event of further trouble, come and we will weep together. And Oshima characterizes this victim consciousness slogan as being precisely that: we will weep together. And as I say, he attributes it not just to this particular cinematic development, but also to the development of Japanese left-wing politics at this time, and in particular to the form in which the Communist Party had cast the struggle against the Japan-American Security Treaty into a very defeatist form, in effect, where in the second period he defines as the pseudo-subjective period, a period where you have the emergence of a form of subjectivity, which is more than simply that consciousness of being fellow victims, as the development in the 50s of the protest song, in a sense, in one sense not dissimilar from the protest songs of movements like CND and so on in the West, but far more, as it were, organized and ritualized precisely as Japanese left-wing politics tradition has been since the war, so that effectively a kind of total organization of political activities round song clubs becomes a very standard form of political activity in the mid-50s, and you see this again in the ceremony, in the sequence of the wedding of the communist uncle, at which everybody sings songs, and the songs actually come from a variety of sources, but among them certainly are the left-wing songs of this period. In particular, the song that Masuo doesn't sing, he says, would have been one of them. This, in the cinema, is characterized by the films of particularly Shindo and a group of directors who begin to work to some degree independently in the Japanese cinema in the mid-50s, but whose emphasis is enormously on the personal, as such, as opposed to the political, and in a sense a kind of cinema which is unlike the first cinema, which is concerned with, as it were, feudal oppression, is now a cinema which is concerned simply with the private existence of its protagonists. The third stage, which for Oshima would be a real, as it were, an authentically subjective cinema, is a cinema of which would correspond to the emergence of a genuine politics, which in a certain sense means a genuine democracy, the emergence of a real conception of the citizen and subject in Japan. Cinematically, it corresponds to what Oshima wants from the young directors. And he sees it as this thing of a constant renewal of forms, that is, a destruction of all the traditional forms and a renewal, and also, of course, of a refusal of the separation between the political and the personal, which characterized the pseudo-subjective era for him. Now, although in a sense he then holds, this article was written in 1963 in the ebb of the 1960 anti-Japan American Security Treaty struggle, Oshima therefore sees, in a sense, the political struggle as already a defeated one, and in some sense within the film, the problem becomes one, again, of a total defeat and contradiction, and results, in fact, in Oshima's own film, in the concern in particular with the criminal. Thus, what is essentially going on in many of the films is on the one hand, a political thematic and a political series of political demands on the characters. On the other, an area of private fulfillment, but, and this is, I think, the crucial kind of Japanese character of this subject, the private and the public can never be held together, either as a demand or in practice. And the result is that the private, and yet on the other hand, neither can the private become a totally autonomous world which is simply separable from and satisfactory independently of the political. And the films oscillate in subject between these two sets of demands and solutions offered, political ones and private ones, and they are organized, as it were, textually in the impossibility of both, usually in sequence. And I think you can see this structure fairly clearly in more or less, in fact I would say probably in all of the films that of Oshima which can be seen in the West, perhaps most obviously in a film like Death by Hanging, which precisely poses the political problem of R, and, as it were, R's own personal acceptance of himself as R, as never holdable together, not holdable together with the state. The state itself can't establish an R who will admit his guilt as R, and therefore be hanged in peace, as it were. Nor, on the other hand, can the JCP or the Korean sister produce precisely the victim consciousness, the version of R as the suffering Korean, the Korean who has only done these things because he was put upon, and therefore should recognize that these private solutions are no longer applicable, and what he should do is join, as it were, a struggle for the liberation of the Korean people in Japan. But again, I think the same structure works in the ceremony, in Masuo's relation to his own family, and his own inability to find either a private or a public solution. And I think, as I say, I think you can trace it in most of the films of the period. Perhaps most strikingly, again, in the Empire of the Senses, which is also, again, concerned with the ways, is concerned with the attempt to effectively find a totally private solution. In a certain sense, there is a kind of hypertrophy of the private moment of that dialectic in Empire of the Senses, with the result that all of the public world that you're left with is that one moment when the hero walks down the street and you suddenly see the children waving the Japanese flags and the army troops which pass, and the character simply looks at these in incomprehension, and they go back then into the greenhouses and into the back into the brothel quarter. But again, there's no attempt to establish as in the kind of Japanese print, an area of private satisfaction which is simply possible and fulfillable, because in practice the disappearance of the public there involves very much the disappearance of any kind of time or organization. Lastly, I think that the same structure is present not at the level of content, but actually in the formal level in the films, again in the way in which the closure of form, which I think is implicit also in this particular notion of the subject, is constantly avoided by Oshima, that none of the films will actually simply allow a conventional fictional closure, that again there is no point of resolution of the various elements, not only at the level of organizing of the subject of the film, but actually at the level of their formal working out. And the result is not only a constant fragmentation of the form of fiction, the constant variation in form, that effectively the films are different from one from another every time, but also in fact the presence in the film of, I think, completely unintelligible elements that as part of the actual organization of the films. This again is noticeable in the way that he uses a kind of screen memory structure, the memories of the characters which recur to them, and which function as an organizing function in some sense for them, part of their private existence, but which are never, as it were, brought into line to a public place from which we have, as it were, access to them. Again, I think perhaps the most striking examples of these are the baseball game in the ceremony, and the very odd screen memory which appears at the climax of Empire of the Senses, the memory of the girl naked fantasy of the girl naked in the center of the arena. Elements which it seems to me are not, which one could attempt to offer interpretations of, but their function in the text is far more to be those kind of holes where, in fact, the private existence of the characters simply cannot be portrayed for us, and so they actually are there simply to fill in a gap which the text leaves for that place. Okay, well, I'm sorry I've been going on for some time. I guess I better stop.